Hello, everyone. Welcome. You are attending SRCD's Tri-Caucus webinar hosted by the Outreach and Communications Subcommittee of the Asian Caucus. This is the third webinar in a series of webinars organized as part of the Tri-Caucus webinar, specifically the Black Caucus and Latinx Caucus. The title of this webinar is Innovative and Mixed Methods in Understanding Development. I am Hee Chu from Purdue University Northwest, and I am the chair of the Outreach and Communications Subcommittee of the Asian Caucus. Today, we are honored to have three speakers, a member from each of the caucuses, to share their experiences implementing innovative and mixed methods in their research with us. They are Dr. Mayra Bámaca-Colbert from Pennsylvania State University, Dr. Enrique Neblett from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Dr. Kaveri Subrahmanyam from California State University, Los Angeles. Each of our speakers will have 20 to 30 minutes to share their work and experience with us. Then we will have 30 minutes for the question and answer session. We have been collecting questions from our participants for the past several weeks. If you have any questions that you would like to ask any of our speakers, please send your questions using the question box located in the toolbar. It is my honor to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kaveri Subrahmanyam. She is a professor of psychology, chair of the Department of Child and Family Studies at the California State University, Los Angeles, and the associate director of the Children's Digital Media Center at Los Angeles. Currently, her research is examining the relation between digital interactions and well-being, sleep, and academic performance. In addition, she is studying the effect of digital screens and multitasking on learning and executive function, as well as parents and children's home media use and children's sleep behavior problems and oral language development. She is a co-author with Dr. David Schmel of Digital Youth, the Role of Media and Development with Springer Publishers. The title of her presentation today is The Promise of Technology for Developmental Research, Opportunities and Challenges. Dr. Subrahmanyam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So just every audience, please bear with me. It's the technology makes me a little nervous, but when technology works, it's great. So here's hoping it goes all smooth. So for the last several years, my research has examined the role of technology on the development of youth. Much of my research has been conducted on Latino youth samples. The topic of my research that's relevant to this webinar today, it has our technology and the role of self-presentation, of identity, in particular ethnic identity, well-being, and technology, as well as the role of technology in academic belonging, as well as success in among Latino emerging adults. Today, however, I'll only talk about two methods. I'm going to focus on two methods. One is early research using a mixed method approach to better understand what youths do online. And then the second one will be a daily diary study on the relation of communication mode and well-being. So before, just to give you a brief outline, I'll start with a little bit of background on this topic, just so that the methods make more sense, and then talk about the research questions. Then I'll describe the methods, including the strengths and challenges, and then I'll wrap up. So with regard to technology and youth, we all know that kids are growing up today immersed in digital technology. Children today are adopting technology at younger and younger ages. They have no conception of life without Google, without Wikipedia. And a lot, as you can see in this this comic strip on the screen, I'm not sure how clear the images are. This is from a few years ago. This is Jeremy Duncan from the comic strip Zips. It was a little more aspirational when this comic strip was actually drawn, but I think it more accurately reflects what we may see in many young adult teens' bedrooms, if you will. The data suggest a similar story. As you can see, 24% of youth on the Pew survey report going online constantly, and 56% go online several times a day. The digital divide is certainly a very important topic that we must briefly discuss when we think about underrepresented youth. In the early years, the question was whether youth even had access to technology. In many ways, that divide seems to have been narrowed in that minority youth do have access, minority youth as well as youth from low-income households do have increased access to technology. However, they continue to use that, continues to be divides primarily in terms of how they access the internet. One is they're less likely to be accessing internet through high-speed broadband. Secondly, they are also more likely to use mobile devices for internet access. This is important because mobile devices may limit you in terms of what technology uses you can actually engage in. Minority youth also consume about 4.5 hours more of television per day. There are also gender differences, with boys spending more time on gaming and girls spending more time on social media, texting, as well as calling on cell phones. With regard to digital media uses, for the most part, youth seem to be using technology for information, entertainment, content creation, and communication. The communication uses of the internet have dominated throughout the years, starting from the early 2000s. And it is clear that young people spend a lot of time with digital tools to engage in peer communication. And it's to the point that digital worlds should now be considered an important new context for development, as important as the family, the school setting, the neighborhood, so on and so forth. With regard to group differences in terms of the popularity of platforms, sorry, just to back up a little bit, as you all are aware, there are a variety of social media applications. And although Facebook was king at one time, it no longer is. I always say, as everybody's parents and their grandparents came onto Facebook, the kids were driven away. They are now more likely to be on Instagram and Snapchat. However, here too, we do see some differences between groups. For instance, African American teens are more likely to use Snapchat, and Latino teens are more likely to use Instagram. So there continue to be group differences. It's a little hard to know why. But nonetheless, these group differences are there and important to keep in mind for any researcher thinking about using social media or digital communication. So moving on, as I said earlier, it is clear that technology is an important context within which we study development. But technology is an interesting context because it also provides a means for conducting developmental research, and it may be particularly valuable to reach underrepresented youth as well as youth in marginalized communities. As we'll see, there are some methods that can really help us get to topics that may be otherwise difficult to study in face-to-face settings where people may not be completely honest or truthful. And so I hope that some of the methods that we shared today will be helpful in that dimension. So as I said, I want to give you a little context of the research questions to make more sense of the methods we used and the choices we made. So to understand the implications of digital communication for well-being, we kind of have to start at the beginning. So when technology first became common or became prevalent and youth gravitate to these settings, I was a media psychologist studying video games, and then it became clear that the internet was something that adolescents loved. But there were many challenges. There was no roadmap because these tools were new. We as adult researchers had no idea what was going on within them. They were also constantly changing. As researchers, studying young people, we have IRB challenges to deal with. And certainly the constantly changing tools made this difficult because we would figure out what was happening, design our study, get IRB approval. And when we were in the field, we would see that the youth were now using something different. So we do have to keep that in mind anytime you embark on using technology. You have to be mindful that the changes in technology happen very rapidly. Making it even more complex, and I think this is an important point for anybody considering using technology, in particular social media apps, is that every tool is different. They're not interchangeable. They have different affordances and they are used differently. What do I mean by different affordances? What it is that affordances is the particular properties of a digital media communication tool that then gives you, the user, the ability to do some things versus others. So for instance, Some tools allow you to be completely anonymous. On Facebook, for instance, you are not that anonymous. There's a difference between whether a tool lets you use text versus pictures. There's differences with regard to the public versus the private nature of the communication. And as a result of all these affordances, there are also differences in whether youth are interacting with strangers versus known others. This may also be dependent upon the technology and how many people are online. So in the early years, you were less likely to meet somebody you knew. On the other hand, that's changed now. So it is important before embarking on a study using social media that we really think about the affordances as well as the particular digital culture that the affordances lead to. So back to how we were studying technology. So in the early years, what we found was that the public chat rooms were text-based. They were completely public, and youth were more likely to interact with strangers because not everybody was online. As time went on and social networking sites became more common, they were more likely to, there were more opportunities for private communication. They were more likely to interact with offline peers within these settings, more multimodal, and allowed youth to actually create wide networks. With the current generation of social media apps as well as mobile devices, you find there's a lot more of interaction. Now you can interact both with friends as well as strangers. You can take it anywhere you go, so much so you're seeing relatively exaggerated behaviors with youth taking them to bed, sleeping with them, so on and so forth. So the tool matters, the affordances of the tool matters, and it is important to consider that when choosing a digital communication app to use either as a venue of development or as a means, a technological vehicle to conduct your research. So back to my question, how did we begin studying? So the approach that we used was that we began by analyzing the affordances of a digital culture, and then we used a developmental framework to study what was going on within that context. And the key here for us was that we had to adapt the methods we used based upon the particular tool or context, because the affordances were different and what youth did was different within them, including what issues or themes they dealt with. So we had to be very flexible, and that I think is important for anybody to consider when using technology in general. You have to keep in mind the constant changing nature of the digital landscape. And although for the technological, the landscape has sort of slowed down a bit, it's calmed a bit, we just never know what may happen, what new innovation in the future may trigger the same kind of changes, the rapid pace of changes. All right, so to begin, I'm going to address two research questions today. The first question was, what do youth do with an online context? So it seems pretty obvious, we've come to a point where we know a fair amount. But back in the day, in the early 2000s, this was not really readily obvious to us. And certainly we could survey them. And surveying is still a technique that we can use. But from the beginning, it was evident that surveys were not a very useful tool to ask young people about technology use. There was a lot of biases, a lot of recall errors, memory lapses. And this has become an even greater problem as the technology has become more diffuse, the devices have become smaller, more portable, more affordable. Everybody has them. You're carrying a computer in your back pocket. Even as adults, I tell people, if someone were to ask us how much time we spend on email in a given day, it would be really difficult for us to give an accurate assessment. And because surveys are so problematic with regard to measuring media use, you will find that a lot of the early research that has used surveys to connect to youth outcomes has produced very mixed findings. For instance, research on the relation between media time and well-being has produced result studies that find positive associations, negative associations, as well as no associations. So we really need more nuanced tools to figure out what youth are doing within online context. So going back in time to when we began this research and we were looking at online chat rooms, these were public spaces run by AOL as well as Yahoo, and anybody could go online and engage in very public text-based conversations, and people were mostly anonymous. We had no idea who these people were. So we decided to use content analysis. Now, content analysis is actually being used pretty widely in the social sciences. It is a mixed method tool. It lets you, it's a nice mix between quantitative and qualitative. So what it does is it lets you quantify in-depth qualitative analysis. And when it originated, was generally done on text-based material, including archival materials, so newspapers, magazines, other kinds of archival material, and was actually used by television researchers. And indeed, it was content analysis that revealed that cartoons were not as benign as we thought they were. They had a fair amount of aggressive content. So we decided to use content analysis to really take an in-depth look into what youth were doing within these spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a few brief examples of what we did and what we found, and then I'm going to dive into the methodological issues, such as how do you record these samples, how do you code them, what are some questions to consider when you embark on coding, and then finally I'll examine the strengths and challenges of each one of them. So so our early studies on chat rooms, which were conducted at the Children's Digital Media Center at LA, are a good example of the mixed methods that we used. So what we did was we literally went into the chat rooms. These were public chat rooms. We literally went in and copied the transcript of the conversation. Just to back up, we used the participant researcher roles. Again, this is back in the 2000s, early 2000s. The IRB process was very different, and we were participant researchers who didn't really disclose that we were researchers. That obviously wouldn't happen today. I think we were all learning the technology, and I think there are several ethical challenges that I hope to address. Also today, when I finished talking about content analysis, so we went in, we extracted 12,000 utterances. And again, going back in time, this was a lot of data. And then we manually, I should say, with our research, as the help of our research assistants and informants, we manually coded them for a variety of adolescent developmental tasks. We did the same for nicknames as well, and we coded them for gender identity as well as sexual identity. We did something similar in the blog studies. At the bottom of the screen, you will see the references. And if people want the particular citations, you can always email me or find them quite easily on scholar.google. With the blog studies, we actually went in and extracted blogs that were created, publicly available blogs that were created by teen authors. These were in English, written in English, a total of 585 entries. And they were analyzed for a variety of developmental themes, including peers, family issues, as well as identity problems. As you can imagine, this represented a fair amount of work, but it was very valuable because it gave us a very rich picture of what actually happened within these spaces. At that time, these technologies were relatively new. There was a lot of fear about them. There still is, and we really didn't know what youth were doing within them. Again, at the time, this was a space that was exclusively inhabited by youth, and there were no adults, and people were understandably anxious. But what we found by doing these in-depth analysis of the conversation was that these spaces really were centered around key adolescent developmental themes. That was common. That was, in fact, what you would expect of youth in this life phase. As you can see, of course, which themes were emphasized varied. Depending upon the space and the affordances, and how they did it also varied. And this is certainly something to keep in mind, that it really does matter which application you use, but at the same time, we shouldn't get too hung up on that and instead focus perhaps on the developmental theme that is the center of this developmental activity or theme around which the activity is focused. So content analysis. So how do you obtain digital discourse samples? For researchers that work with you, this is almost like being in a candy store, right? You have so many options with technology. And this is what also makes it challenging. So as I mentioned earlier, when we conducted the studies, we just did manual extractions. We went into the space and we copied the transcript. It wasn't a lot of work. It was 30 minutes. I think we had about a total of 10 transcripts, which gave us the 12,000 utterances. Today, of course, as the technology has become more accessible, we have many more choices. Depending upon the device, you could actually install software that lets you do automatic recording of the discourse, or you can use several programs, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, and go in and scrape. The word scrape is used to describe the extraction of digital discourse. So let's talk a little bit about extracting digital discourse samples using technological means. As I said, one option is the automated recording of private content. I believe that the BlackBerry project is one good example of this. In this case, the study was conducted by Marian Underwood when she was at the University of Texas at Dallas by Underwood and colleagues. In this study, all the participants were given BlackBerry devices with the plans were paid for by the researchers, and with the consent of the children and their families. Software was installed on the devices, and all of the communication, text messaging, emails, as well as instant messaging, which was what was big then. All of that was automatically recorded and stored in a secure, searchable database. So I've given the citation of the study here. It was published in Developmental Psychology 2012, a special issue that I co-edited with Patricia Greenfield. And the citation will give the citation below. You can go find more details of exactly how they did it. Another similar software is digital footprints. This is where you have to get the permission of the user to go in and then extract both public as well as private communication from their devices. There are, of course, other means. So the BlackBerry project as well as digital footprints really are talking about more private communication and actually getting the approval of the participant and getting all of the communication. You have some other choices as well, especially for publicly available content, for instance, tweets. And again, you have web scraping software. Google Chrome, for instance, has a free version. In vivo Facebook capture, again, does a little bit what digital footprints does. Digital footprints also lets you scrape content, public and private. And of course, you can write your own program, although I don't really recommend that we do this. We're probably, any of us thinking of this should really work with a computer programmer or tie up with a computer scientist at your university to do this. So that's the issue of extracting. As you can see, you have a lot of choices in terms of what you do. And I would say I see a lot of people getting excited about using a cool tool or another cool tool to collect data. But I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of being able to get data so easily and getting so much of data that it's really important to consider carefully what your research questions are, what information you actually need, and try and be a little selected. Otherwise, you really can have too much data. So before we go into the coding challenges, you also have to make some decisions as to how you're going to sample the discourse. Are you going to collect the data in real time? Are you going to go back and extract them like we did? What we did in the chat rooms was collecting the conversation in real time. Our blog study was going back and getting historically collected data. The search terms that you will use are very important. If you don't use the right search term, you're not going to get what you want. Unfortunately, there's a lot of variability in digital discourse, including in the way people spell things, and this will mean that you have to spend a fair amount of time thinking about what search terms you're going to use. And then, of course, the big question, the million-dollar question, how much data are you going to extract? How many thousands or millions of tweets do you want? Do you also want other information such as geo information, which gives you the latitude and longitude of where somebody is when they are posting? Do you also want responses, feedback that people get from their audience? So do you want the number of likes that a picture gets, the number of retweets that a tweet gets? All of these are things you really have to consider before you embark on your study. And I said earlier, it's really important to consider the affordances and your research questions. Similarly, when it comes to coding, you have a lot of choices. Do you want to go human? Do you want to use machine learning or computational coding? I know that computational coding seems very attractive, but I think is increasingly clear that what works best is some sort of a hybrid approach, which blends the strengths of the human, where humans do conduct the coding, and then the machine learns how you do it. So the coding is the area where where content analysis perhaps is the most amount of work. Every study has some elements every method has some elements that are easy, some that are difficult. With content analysis, you get a lot of data very quickly, can get a very rich picture of what's happening, but coding is the elephant in the room. You have to it's qualitative coding. You do a first pass, you identify the themes that you're interested in. Typically, we use grounded theory or maybe thematic analysis. But as I said in the beginning, it's best to have a theoretical framework and questions that you're interested in. It is considered exploratory, and that's what makes it difficult, because you have a lot of choices. You do have to make some informed decisions as to what you want to focus on. Equally challenging is that digital discourse is not simple, can be very complex, and you have to establish inter-rater reliability, and that can take a long time to establish to get acceptable levels of reliability. You have to make decisions along the way. You have to keep track of your decisions. The other problem, of course, is that oftentimes you have adults coding kids' conversations, and this is quite problematic, and I will talk about that when I review the strengths and challenges of this method. Coding is an important aspect that you have to you have to spend a fair amount of time thinking about. Okay. All right, so I want to wrap up with the strengths and challenges of content analysis. It really gives you an in-depth look into what youth are doing, particularly if topics are sensitive, such as discrimination, or even private, such as identity, where you're concerned whether you're actually going to get the truthful answers or what's really happening. So it really helps you go in and dive in, and can be very valuable if you can connect it to age, gender, and other offline variables. The challenges. You really can't have too much data. And then you would have data overload, and it can take you a long time to sift through the data and figure out what you want and how you want to code it, etc. This is a huge issue, which is why I moved away from content analysis and automatic recording, because I just didn't have the manpower, if you will, to engage in this kind of coding. The coding is also often happening from an outsider's perspective. Well, we as adults don't necessarily know the subculture of youth. And this is even more of a challenge when you have underrepresented or marginalized teens. You need to do it with informants who can really have a good sense of what's going on, what actually is happening in the digital discourse. Pictures are also tricky. Or even more tricky. You don't know where the picture necessarily was taken, what's the significance of it for the users. You have to spend a lot of time thinking about that. Finally, there are ethical challenges, particularly when if you go into Facebook and you get the entire communication, you need to consider approval of the people who responded on somebody's wall. A lot of ethical challenges from what I can see, a lot of variation in how IRBs deal with it, how they, what they allow and what they don't allow. Some are very liberal, they let you collect anything and everything. Others are much more constrained. So what you can do will really depend upon what your IRB is willing to let you do. So you have to keep that in your mind from the beginning. My time is ending, and I clearly have too many slides, so I'm going to try and wrap up a little bit. An alternative to content analysis that I really like, that I did in a couple studies with a very diverse sample of emerging adults. Instead of us going in and coding people's photographs, we have asked our participants to identify 3 pictures, describe them, explain what it meant and why it was important to them. We got some really interesting results with regard to identity and identity presentation. The results are here on the slide as well. But what I want to point out was what we found very interesting was that our sample of Latino emerging adults are at an HSI. And very interestingly, for these adults, we saw very little ethnic identity presentation. So what our study suggests is that identity presentation can really matter, can really depend upon the larger context within which the youth is. So in an institution where you are with a lot of other people like you, maybe ethnic identity is not something that you are engaging a lot in your public Facebook spots. Not that it's not important, it's just not something that you spend a lot of time thinking about and crafting an image, which is completely contrary to what findings from people in other spaces. So this is a nice blend, I think, between which capitalizes on the strengths of content analysis, but at the same time, not getting too bogged down with too much data and also taking into account the user's own perspective. I also wanted to talk about daily diary study that I did. Just very briefly, what we did was we went in and recruited a sample of college students and asked them to keep daily diaries for 1 week using online surveys. And daily diaries are great because, as I said before, survey studies are really problematic in that you just don't know what people are feeling, and there's a lot of retrospective mistakes and errors. And by sampling people every day, asking them what they did that day, and then also how they felt that day, it really lets you get a better sense of the relation between daily behaviors and outcomes. So I'm just going to go down a bit fast here because I'm clearly running out of time. And also Mayra, who's going to be speaking next, will talk about an EMA study that will give you, a sense of exactly how daily diary studies are done. Very briefly, I think they're useful for frequent behaviors because they limit retrospective bias. However, the challenges, of course, are that they are time-consuming and they're particularly hard to recruit a sample of males, and they're difficult to collect in the middle of the day, such as when youth are in school. There's a citation here. Again, I apologize, I'm running out of time, so feel free to email me and I can send you these links. So I want to wrap up here. Technology presents both a venue as well as a means for developmental research. Big data present new opportunities for analyzing digital communication, but you do have to be careful and thoughtful before you embark on that. Daily diaries and EMAs, about which you'll hear more next, may provide opportunities to study digital communication in the moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Subrahmanyam, for sharing your exciting work with us. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mayra Bámaca-Colbert. She is an associate professor in human development and family studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She received a PhD in family studies and human development from Pennsylvania State University, a master's degree in human and community development from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and a bachelor's in psychology from California State University, Northridge. Her research applies a cultural contextual development framework to answer questions about adaptive parenting, family dynamics, cultural influences, and Latino youth adjustment. Currently, she is an associate editor for the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships and guest editor for a special issue in developmental psychology focused on hidden populations. Her research has been published in outlets such as Developmental Psychology, Journal of Youth and Adolescence, Family Process, and Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. Today, she will speak on using mobile technology to study the daily experiences and exposures of Latino youth and families. Dr. Bámaca-Colbert, please.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this very lovely discussion. I'm going to actually take a different approach in that I am actually just starting to delve into these innovative methods. So I don't have as much data, but I do have a lot to say about the learning process on these mobile technologies. Before anything else, I want to, I hope this works. I want to start by acknowledging my collaborators, Don Witherspoon, Bob Cleveland, Stephen Matthews, Amanda Griffin, and my graduate and undergraduate students. So just to give you a little overview of the work that I do, and my colleague, Don Witherspoon, who we work closely together on these topics, we look at contextual realities and how they actually affect parent-child dynamics or family context, and also adolescent well-being. We are also moving on to looking at the school context and peer influences. I want to bring attention to the importance of place. Don Witherspoon is interested in neighborhood effects and, more broadly speaking, on activity spaces. And I hope that I have time to also talk about these methodology to tap into understanding better the effect of place on individuals' lives. So we know that, when you do a cross-sectional design, you can just have a one-time assessment for individuals and try to understand how variables are related. But we can also, go into a longitudinal design and perhaps give individuals yearly assessments or every 6 months assessments. Or what some people are doing is actually focusing on a couple of weeks or a month, 30 days, and trying to understand more about their daily lives, individuals' daily lives. And you can actually do these with, longitudinally, and you can decide to do this every 6 months where you're going to have the participants actually fill out surveys for you on a daily basis. I think that a little bit of this was covered before. Daily diary methods are important in that they allow for reporter events and experiences in their natural, spontaneous context, providing information complementary to that is obtained by more traditional designs. And it dramatically reduces the likelihood of retrospection and recall bias. We are going to talk today about ecological momentary assessments. They can actually be done once daily, twice daily, 3 times daily. They can be programmed by the research team in which days you want them, which times you want them to be received by the participants, or they can be actually self-initiated by the participant. And intensive ecological momentary assessments investigate individuals during their daily lives, in the moment, or soon after the experience happened. They provide hyper-reliable assessments of moods and experiences, also information on how people react to daily challenges in their lives, and information on how within-person processes relate to life outcomes. We use smartphone devices, but others have use paper pencil surveys. That's how it actually has started in the beginning, but now with technology, this is how it is generally being done. Or you can also send links to the participants to their own phone devices or computer devices so that they can actually go straight to a link and fill out a survey. So it really depends on your population, which of the means can actually get you the best. Daily surveys are expected to be short, not too long. They should be lasting about 5 minutes max. There's different expectations on that. You can do them once daily, maybe at the end of the day, maybe once only after school, or you can do them multiple times a day, in the morning, afternoon, evening. You can do 5, 10. They can be fixed again times or random times. So for example, in one study that I am collaborating, Bo Cleveland and his team were focused on homeless youth, and they wanted to understand more about the school experiences and the outside the school experiences for homeless youth. And so we have actually 2 surveys there. One afternoon survey, because we cannot really collect data during the school time, as has been mentioned before. And then the afternoon or after school survey would actually ask participants about reflecting back on the day at school, different questions about it. And then we have an evening survey where we are asking adolescents about after school experiences such as homework and social experiences outside of school. So what are some of the different research questions that can be asked using this method? Well, one of the ones that we have tried to tap into is how daily positive and negative interactions with peers and school personnel affect youth daily negative and positive affect. What is important, as was mentioned before, is that you select variables that definitely can tap into variability either across days or within days. And so some of the ones that have been found to vary a lot across the day are mood. Stress is also stress in different domains of one's life. People have also been looking at parenting and how that might be changing across days. And there is evidence that certain parenting domains can change. So one day you can, be very engaged with your child, maybe be on top of everything that they're doing. And other days you might be so overwhelmed that you might actually not be as engaged, might have a little bit lower temper, a shorter temper. And so these are some of the variables that we can find variability at the daily level. It is also important that you pay attention to how you ask the questions in daily diaries. If you want to know something about the individual at the moment that they are filling out the survey, you will have to start with like right now. Right now I feel joyful, and the participant will say how much they believe that to be true. But also, if you are asking them to reflect back on the school day, then you will probably premise sections about, like, right now we're going to ask about your school day. At the school today, did you feel happy? How happy did you feel? How sad did you feel? Today, I felt emotionally supported at school. So it really depends on when you're going to be assessing this during the day, whether you want them to recollect right after the event happened. And for getting experiences within the school context, we really have to actually have the participant reflect back, unless you get a school that will allow you to have the participants fill out the surveys in the school time, which I don't know, maybe that happens, but I don't think that happens a lot. Why are these important? As you can see here, in this example, just a hypothetical example, there are 20 occasions here where somebody fill out a question about something during the day, let's say mood. And you can see that there is an average score, but there is also a lot of variation within that average. And so you can see that this one individual has a lot of changes across the many occasions in terms of how they feel. You can see that there's a lot of variability also across participants. So each of the lines here is a participant. And some of them are more consistently, average. Others really are up and down in terms of reporting on positive relationships or interactions with people. And this is across 7 days. We have done some presentations. This is data from Bob Cleveland's study. So one of the questions that was asked is, how do daily positive and negative interactions with close friends affect homeless youth's daily sense of success? So at the end of the day, they were asked about how successful they felt for the day, and we also asked them after school to reflect back on the school interactions that they had with their best friend. And as you can see here, although, definitely average levels of interactions were predictive of perceptions of daily success, so were these daily interactions that they had with their close friends. So when the adolescent reported that they had more negative interactions with their close friend earlier in the day, they actually reported not feeling as successful at the end of the day. What are the challenges? So there's definitely a lot of challenges. I've done a lot of research when we only do a one-time assessment, and with minority families, bilingual families, or monolingual Spanish families, there's a lot of challenges just to start with the one-time assessments. But daily assessments are definitely more demanding. People who are at risk or under more stress may be less likely to enroll in the study when they know the commitment that they have to make, or if they enroll, they might still have a hard time adhering to the prolonged data collection periods because they have a lot of stressors in their lives. There's a lot more financial cost to these type of studies, which then equals to a lot of other changes that you might have to do. So cost means fewer participants, so you might want to have 300 participants or 300 families with parent and adolescent, but with the inclusion of technology across days, you have to pay participants for each of the days, then this really becomes a very expensive study. You need more research personnel because these individuals have to be engaged with the families on a daily or every 2 days. We have to check on their consistency in filling out surveys daily, and then we have to email them messages, either, yay, great that you are continuing completing the surveys, or if they are not, we text them again to say, well, we have noticed that you haven't been completing the survey. So we have to do a lot of engagement with these families and also looking at this data in the moment, kind of. You also have to think about the fact that, there are applications that you can use, so people can create applications with these surveys, and creating apps definitely is more expensive. With Don Witherspoon, we have been trying to figure out how to do this because we also want to have the GPS data being collected every 30 seconds. So we have to have an app that has both the ability to have the daily assessments to get their own experiences, but also have the GPS to give us their whereabouts throughout the day. You also have to realize, even though, definitely kids nowadays have a lot of access to the internet, the reality is that some of the families that I work with may have phones, and they do, but they may not have reliable service. And so you have to think whether you need to invest in actually providing phones for them and a service for them. So there's a lot of additional expense. Because I work with Latino families and they, many of the parents are monolingual, I also have to think about creating multiple versions of these surveys, which requires more time, more expense. So, just for the study that I'm currently piloting, I have 3 surveys daily, one in the morning, one after school, one in the evening. I have 2 people, caregiver and youth. I have versions in Spanish and English for all of them. And we also have some different versions for the weekday and the weekend because we don't ask the same questions. Some of them are asked across days, but others are really not asked on weekends. So potentially you can have 24 versions on this one study that is definitely very simple study compared to others where they have a lot more assessments during the day. So how is this method important for understanding development of children and youth from underrepresented and marginalized groups? Well, we can learn a lot about their unique daily experiences, such as discrimination and risk exposure, across contexts and across days. So is the exposure or the experiences of discrimination the same at school, then in the neighborhood, on weekdays versus weekends? Is risk exposure different across different contexts, different places? And so this is definitely an important direction that we are trying to take in our work. And both Don and I are really interested in normative experiences and trying to understand more about just the normative lives of Latino kids. So who are kids spending time with daily? You can ask that during your EMA. You can ask them, who are you with? Where are you at? How are you feeling in that location? And the variability in terms of who they're spending time with can actually be related to problem behaviors that the individual engage in that day or their mood. So there's really a lot of different questions that we can ask with this methodology. What research training is required? I would say that the main thing perhaps is to have training in multi-level modeling, because that will help you with both analyzing and interpreting the data. I do not have that kind of training, to be honest with you, so I've been kind of reading about these things, but I have a really good team that definitely has knowledge on those different domains. So you really need to become familiar with the methodology to understand it better, but also really team up with a really strong group that has knowledge on this methodology and also on the constructs that you might be really interested in exploring. So for example, you can ask find out what contextual domains may vary frequently, and what aspects of adjustment vary frequently versus those that may not have a lot of variability across days. So for example, there is research out there using ecological momentary assessments on substance use, and they actually have a hard time finding variability within 30 days. However, stressors are definitely found to be variable within days and across days. You also need to, from your team, need to decide how many days you need to assess. You can do 5 days, 7 days, 30 days. And one thing that we're finding out right now is that you need that team to help you how to handle the data and how to create the database, because the way that you set up your data will definitely determine a lot about how easy or difficult it will be to actually run analysis. So we actually spend a whole hour just trying to decide on how to label the variables. Is that minute, but so critical for long-term success. These are the papers that my colleagues actually recommended that I suggested to you guys. So these are some of the key readings on this topic. I briefly want to see if I can talk about activity space, which is another mobile. Well, we can study it with mobile technology. So activity space is places individuals navigate to during their daily activities. They are frequent day-to-day locations that any individual can visit. And it is believed that people utilize Go and are attached to multiple places. And these activity spaces, the size of the activity space, how much you go farther out of your neighborhood, all of these things have actually been linked to mental and physical health outcomes. And there's also some initial work being done in terms of how activity spaces of parents can actually impact their own parenting, not at the daily level, because that paper was not looking at daily experiences. You can tap into activity spaces by giving self-reported long measures where you can ask participants to give you the 10 top places that they visit on a week, and then you get the addresses, and then you retrieve U.S. Census information about those places. Or you can also just have GPS tracking and create GIS mapping to kind of delve into the size of the activity space, but also the quality of that space in terms of the characteristics of demographic characteristics of that place. For us, well, let me give you just an example of what this activity space, looks like in picture. So we have here one individual, and the red dot here is the home of the individual. The pink circle is actually the home 500-meter buffer, which is generally used to assess neighborhood factors that can be related to adjustment. So you kind of just get all the census information about this 500-meter buffer. But all those green dots that you see there are the activity spaces that this individual navigated through the day. So definitely is beyond the neighborhood. This person is navigating outside of their neighborhood. And so then you can also create this 500-meter buffer around the GPS points and try to not only estimate, you can estimate the length of time that you spend at a certain place. You can also look at the demographic characteristics of the activity space overall. So we did a pilot looking at trying to figure out if we can use actually this technology with Latino families. It was a 7-day study, 5 diets, and we covered 225 census blocks. From this activity space study, we actually found out, based on GPS coordinates, that the amount of time in the residential neighborhood was the largest. So caregivers spend from 74 to 88% of their time in the residential neighborhood, and adolescents experience 84 to, not experience, but stayed in the neighborhood 84 to 100% of their time. Also, we found that caregivers' activity spaces were larger than adolescents' activity spaces for this pilot. We are really interested in understanding how the combined activity space of the parent and the adolescent can relate to parent-child dynamics. I'm also interested about how that the share time or space that these parent-child dyads have can be related to acculturation processes. Here you can see that not everybody is sharing, all the time with their parents in the same space. So for the caregiver youth dyad A, you see that there's a lot of overlap. But for B and C, there's definitely a lot less overlap between the parent and the adolescent in the same spaces. We actually we have conducted a study of only GPS. We don't have EMA technology implemented in that study, but it's 60 dyads, and is showing here only 12 dyads. We have complete data for the GPS information. This is done with Latino parents and youth, and the youth in this sample were on average 13 in age. And what you can see here is that for this subsample of 12, Latino parents and adolescents spend, again, a considerable amount of time in their neighborhoods, in fact, 3/4 of the time on average. But it was actually higher for the pilot study. And one of the things that is different between the pilot and this study is that the pilot actually was conducted just in the summer, whereas this study was conducted across a series of months. We also find here that the adolescent activity size was larger than their parents in this study or in this subsample, and a greater proportion of adolescents' activity space is shared with their parents. And we found a trend relationship with adolescents who spend more time in their residential neighborhood being engaged in fewer deviant behaviors. So we can see how then these activity spaces can be related to parent-child dynamics also, as well as engaging in certain behaviors for the adolescent. I think I may be done with my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mayra Bámaca-Colbert. I want to take this time to encourage attendees to post their questions in the questions box in their toolbox so that we can address the questions to our speakers. Now let's move on to our last speaker. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Enrique Neblett from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Neblett's research focuses on understanding the differential impact of racism-related stress experiences on African-American and ethnic minority youth health outcomes and overall wellness. Adopting developmental psychopathology and risk and resilience frameworks, he explores underlying protective and vulnerability mechanisms and pathways in the relation between racism-related stress and impairment in youth's academic, social, mental, and physical health outcomes. The title of this presentation is Innovative Methods in Understanding Development, Psychophysiological Responses to Racism-Related Stress in Youth Experiencing Marginalization. Now I'd like to hand it over to you, Dr. Neblett.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to begin by just thanking the Asian Caucus for the invitation to be here to share with you some prior work that we've done in the area of cardiovascular psychophysiology. In particular, it's an honor to be here and to also share the stage this afternoon with my fellow panelists. I'm starting out here with a brief agenda. If my slides advance here. Okay, my slides are not advancing. Give me 1 second here. Let's see if I can figure out. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So what I'd like to do today is start out with a little bit of background and talk about the motivation and research for how I got into this work. And then spend a little bit of time talking with you about cardiovascular psychophysiology methods in particular. Once I'm done with that, I'll talk a little bit, as some of the prior presenters have, about some of the methodological challenges that I've encountered in doing this work, as well as some of the research training that's required to do work in this area. So for a long time, I've been interested in understanding resilience processes in African American and racial and ethnic minority youth. And while ago, I read a paper by Sunil Luthar, which made me think about some things. She said that a hallmark of current generation of resilience research is attention to process. And she talked about the fact that even though we say process is important, we oftentimes have not done a good job of untangling the process. So here she says, despite exhortations almost 2 decades ago that underlying processes need to be understood, there's been little headway in disentangling the relative importance of such processes in conferring protection not only during childhood, but also beyond, extending into the adult years. And she goes on to say that it's really imperative that resilience researchers begin to pay concerted attention to biological processes. If we really want to think about intervention research, she argued that most programs at the time do not really have explicit theories on the pathways through which improvements actually occur. And so for a long time, I've been thinking about what are some of the methods that we can actually use to advance our understanding of process. Okay, let's see if there's another way. I'm having some difficulties here. Slides are not advancing again. Okay, there we go. I apologize for the difficulties. I'm not sure why my slides are not advancing, but hopefully we'll be able to continue going here. So here's a quote I wanted to start out with regard to thinking about psychophysiological methods. One of my mentors from Howard University, Kamara Jules Harrell, wrote the following quote. He said, "Methods are psychologists' tools. Some techniques and approaches slip out of vogue quickly and become buried at the bottom of the tool bag. Others have a longer shelf life, and generations of researchers find them useful. More than 10 years have passed since we have made a supportive argument for psychophysiology, and it's time to determine if anything more than, quote, an ounce of value has been forthcoming. Has psychophysiology, like the old jigsaw, proven itself durable and useful? Will psychophysiological methods deserve the research of African descent in this new century?" And what I hope to show you, assuming my slides advance here, is that this is a useful tool that can be used to get at some of the underlying processes that Sunil Luthar was talking about when she said we want to dig a little bit deeper in developmental research. Oh man, okay. All right, so not advancing again, but we're gonna be patient, hopefully. Okay. Okay, there we go. So in terms of thinking about psychophysiology in the 21st century, we know that there are many techniques where we've all heard of PET scans and fMRI. There have even been more recent discussions around more non-invasive technologies. So of course, many of us are familiar with saliva, cortisol, looking at cortisol ratios and other hormones. There have been studies looking at urine and blood as well. More recently, I've even heard people discussing pupillometry, which is a newer measure that is using changes in pupil diameter to get at some estimations of functioning of different aspects of the autonomic nervous system. There have been many breakthroughs in ambulatory assessment. So it used to be the case that many of these methods could only be used in a laboratory setting. Now it's the case that through wearables and other techniques, you can sort of attach the device to an individual and they can leave the lab and you can collect some of these measures in naturalistic settings. What's even more exciting about the devices is that they've gotten smaller over time. So it used to be that these devices were really huge and the battery life was really short, but now they've gotten smaller over time and you can figure out ways to extend quite a while outside of the laboratory. One of the key ideas behind psychophysiological research is that we're paying careful attention to a physiological change in order to find out more about the underlying psychological process. So in terms of what kinds of questions psychophysiological methods can answer, they really get at questions that seek to understand processes that are maybe not immediately apparent through the detection of changes in physiology. Okay, ooh, we went, we got that one, good. So a little bit about my program of research and the things I've been looking at over the last 10 to 15 years. I've been interested in understanding the link between racism-related stress experiences and health outcomes. And the work started out, my training is as a cardiovascular as a clinical psychologist, and became interested in looking at physical health outcomes as well. Some of the things we've looked at in our work have included blood pressure, thinking about cardiovascular health, and then more recently we've also looked at with some of my former students, Daniel Lee, for example, cortisol and telomere length as well. I've also been interested in understanding resilience and vulnerability factors. So how do things like racial identity, socialization, and African values kind of mitigate or alleviate the impact of racism-related stress? And you'll see as I go through the presentation some of the ways in which we've combined all of these to look at how these resilience factors might mitigate some of the effects of racism-related stress on health. Some of the theoretical and conceptual models that I've used in my work include this well-known model by Rodney Clark, the biopsychosocial model of racism. There's quite a bit on the slide perhaps, but if you look towards the bottom, near health outcomes, you'll notice a box that says psychological and physiological stress responses. And one of the questions that many of us have had for a long time is how do perceptions of racism-related stress lead to negative health outcomes? Clark and colleagues argued that these perceptions of racism lead to exaggerated psychological and physiological responses, and that over time, this may wear and tear on physiological systems and lead to compromised health outcomes. More recently, we have used frameworks like David Williams and Selena Mohammed's framework, looking at the study of racism and health. And again, if you think about the process, this is a simplified version of Williams and Mohammed's model, but if you look towards the right side of the screen, you'll see that physiological responses, again, are implicated in understanding racial health disparities. So in thinking about things developmentally, if we want to understand how racial health disparities develop over time, we've got to pay attention to how stress, racial discrimination in particular, interacts with other stressors, other levels of racism to influence physiological responses that compromise mental and physical health. I want to comment here briefly that sometimes folks think the physiological responses are only relevant for physical health, but the specific measures I'll be talking with you about today have actually been implicated in disorders of mental and physical health, psychopathology as well. And so for those of you who don't study physical health and are more focused on mental health, these measures can also be important to incorporate into your research methods. So a couple of different ways of thinking about psychophysiological approaches. There are self-report or correlational models that kind of ask, do the perceptions of experience correlate with changes in physiological arousal? So this is giving someone a survey, asking them about their experiences of discrimination and looking at whether that correlates with changes in heart rate or blood pressure, for example. Another approach is something we call basic psychophysiology. So this is examining an analog of a racial encounter, so not actual racism itself, but asking someone to imagine a racism vignette. or perhaps watching something and taking a look at the physiological effects that occur as they watch a racial encounter occur or imagine such an encounter occurring. And some of the basic psychophysiology research looked at whether race-related encounters would compare or have a more exaggerated response than non-racial encounters, for example. The particular technique I'm going to show you from our research is something we call moderated psychophysiology. So these are using individual or person level factors as predictors or moderators of physiological response. So to what extent do personality attributes or things like racial identity kind of moderate or change the relationship and how people respond to these different analogs of racial encounters. Okay, I guess we had a number of slides of working well here, so we've decided to stop working. Bear with me here. Okay. So here's an example of a study we did in 2012. This was with late adolescents. These were late teens, I think 18-year-olds. And we were interested in understanding, does racial identity kind of moderate the link between racial discrimination and blood pressure, okay? This is an example. The citation is listed later in the presentation. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but I wanted to give you an example of what we mean by moderated psychophysiology. And in this case, we said, well, there's a link between discrimination and blood pressure. We want to understand if there are different racial and cultural, sort of protective factors that can moderate the link between discrimination and blood pressure. And what we found in this study is that when you looked at profiles of racial identity, they actually did moderate the link between discrimination and blood pressure. So if you look on the left panel, you'll see that there was actually a negative relationship between racial discrimination and blood pressure. And then we also looked at African-centered values. If you look at the right panel, you'll notice that individuals who had a sort of high endorsement of African-centered values, there was actually a negative relationship between discrimination and diastolic blood pressure. Okay, so one of the things and advantages of this method to think about is that psychophysiology helps us to get at things that may be going on that a person may not be able to detect or report. There may be biases, as the earlier presenters have mentioned, in terms of recall, and things that may not just be in your conscious awareness. And perhaps through using physiological measures, we can find out changes that are happening in the body that individuals may not be aware of. Okay, so let me talk to you about another specific example of cardiovascular psychophysiology that's an extension of this moderated model. We did a study where we were looking at individual and situational correlates of physiological responses to racism. And what we wanted to know in the study, similar to the blood pressure study I just shared with you, was whether or not patterns of racial identity would moderate how people responded to imagining racism vignettes, okay? And so what we did in this particular experiment is something called a visual imagery paradigm. We had 2 sessions in which individuals first came in for an orientation session, and they completed a number of questionnaires that asked them about various socio-demographic aspects, and then asked them about their racial identity, okay? We also had them get into the practice of imagining what a vignette might be, okay? So we didn't hook them up to the sensors or electrodes, but we just had them kind of practice imagining a neutral scene, okay? So that was session 1. In the second session, what we did is we had folks come into the lab again, this is about a week later, and expose them to an experimental session in which there was continuous psychophysiological measurement. So after orienting the youth to the lab, we had them sit down and we attached sensors there are about 7 sensors. They kind of peel off and on like Band-Aids. And we attach them to the trunk of the body. So there are about 3 electrodes that go on the front of the body. Some are on the side, on the rib cage, and then there are 2 electrodes that are placed on the person's back. And together, these electrodes, or sensors as we call them in the study, help us to get at changes in blood flow and other aspects of heart rate and heart function. The experimental manipulation in our study was that we manipulated whether the scenarios that they imagined had blatant or subtle, or that should say neutral on the 3rd bullet, as a kind of controlled condition, instances of racism. So in the blatant condition, individuals were imagining being called a racial slur. I believe I have an example of the script for that on the next slide. In the subtle condition, individuals were standing in a line and they imagined that someone called the person behind them in their place, sort of overlooking them in the line. And then our control condition was kind of just taking a walk in the park or shopping in the grocery store. Additional manipulations in this design included varying the race of the perpetrator. We wanted to see, does it matter if it's a Black perpetrator versus a white perpetrator who's doing the perpetrating, if you will. And then we looked at, if you look at bullet 4 here, repeated measures design, also time or period as another within subjects variable. So we looked at over 60-minute time segments, whether there would be a change in how the heart was responding as a function of racial identity. Okay, so what individuals did after we got them hooked up is sat down for a 4-minute period that was repeated multiple times. It was a 6 scenario experiment within subjects design. And the first 60 seconds consisted of the individual kind of sitting quietly. This is what we call kind of a baseline measurement. The second 60 seconds, the individual would actually hear the scenario that we asked them to imagine. So we kind of say, don't start imagining yet, just listen to what we'd like you to, kind of think about. And then the third 60-second period was a period in which one actively imagined the scene that we just presented during the second 60 seconds, okay? So we would say something like, start imagining the scene from the beginning of the description, okay? Finally, after 60 seconds of imagining the scenario, individuals would kind of, again, sit quietly. We call this the recovery period, and we would, kind of just let them kind of return to baseline or see if their physiological response would return to baseline. So this is what I was alluding to in talking about period in the last slide. The manipulation was looking at whether there would be different changes as a function of what period we were examining. Okay, would cardiovascular rate go back to baseline in the recovery period? Would folks get, kind of activated during the imagination of the scenario, so on and so forth? Okay, so I've already mentioned that we use 6 racism analogs to kind of get folks, imagining these different types of racism. The scenarios we crafted, I'm happy to share them if folks want to email me, were about 60 seconds long, consistent with the periods that I mentioned. We had to make sure that they were all about 100 plus or minus 10 words long, and that they contained the same number of kind of what we call response propositions, and you'll see these in the next slide. So these are things about your muscles tensing or other kinds of physiological kind of mentions that are typical in this approach and research. And of course, we balance actor race so that it wasn't confounded with the content of the scenario. Okay, so here's a sample scenario. We'd say something like, you are driving along a suburban street when a car like yours screeches past you at high speed. Then you see a police car behind you with its red lights flashing. To your surprise, the white policeman pulls you over and begins to criticize you for speeding. You feel your heart pounding in your chest as you realize his mistake. Muscles tensing, you try to explain what happened, but he cuts you off saying you N-word are all the same. And I should mention that in the actual experiment, we actually used the racial epithet. While struggling to control your temper, you sit fuming to yourself while the policeman writes out the ticket. Okay, so that would be what they would hear during the listen period. And then we would say, start imagining the scene from the beginning of the description. Okay, and that they would now have 60 seconds with their eyes closed to imagine this scenario. Some of the things we looked at in the particular measures we've used are RSA, or respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is an index of the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest component of the nervous system. And then pre-ejection period, which is a measure of the contractility, or how much blood the heart is forcing out of the aorta. And so this is accepted as an index of sympathetic nervous system activity, okay? One of the beauties of this particular methodology that we use is that you can kind of tease apart or dismantle the overall autonomic nervous system response and look at kind of flight or fight response, as well as rest and digest, okay? And in terms of thinking about why this is important, if we've argued that process is important, and we've argued that the sympathetic nervous system may play a role in race-related stress leading to physical and racial health disparities, we want to be able to use a method that actually allows us to pair these apart. And so that's what we did in our study. Okay, in one of the papers that we published using this method, Neblett and Roberts in 2013, the legend is hard to read, but it doesn't matter. I'll tell you what we found. That was that when we looked at sympathetic activation, you'll notice if you look at the bars to the right of each panel, you'll notice kind of an exaggerated or larger response with the bar pointing downward. That shows sympathetic physiological activation. And what we observed in this study is that for individuals who said being Black is really important to my identity, when they imagined the vignettes with white perpetrators, they had a flight or fight response, okay? This was also true for individuals who said, I feel really positively about being African American. In fact, if you look on the right panel, you'll see the bars even larger. Individuals who said, I feel really good about being Black, their sympathetic nervous system, when they imagined that any of the scenes, it wasn't specific to the blatant condition, but any scenario that had a white perpetrator, they had an exaggerated, or I wouldn't say exaggerated, but they had a large physiological response. Okay, what are some of the challenges in doing this work? Well, I think some have argued that, you've got to clean the data. Oftentimes, after you collect this data, you have to look at the waveform, clean out things we call movement artifact. Sometimes if folks are moving around too much, there can be artifact in the waveform that you have to clean or remove from the data. In general, I would say that we don't have to do this too much. The technology and software has gotten so good that even if you give a little bit of movement, the software is able to detect where the heartbeats are. And so that's not too much of a problem. We've gotten better with kind of equipment. Battery life is longer if we want to go outside the lab and use ambulatory. But it used to be that if we are, sort of focusing on ambulatory methods, there were limits, and there still are. You can't have someone wear a device and not shower for a week, for example. The batteries go longer, but there are limits to how long you can actually measure or detect these differences. The third one I'll mention quickly is that some have argued that using racism analogs may not map onto the actual experience of racism. Okay, so some well-known emotional scholars who have expertise in that area have published a number of papers saying that the same physiological response you get from the analogs is equivalent to actual experiences, and they've showed that in their work. But there are a number of more recent scholars, like Laurie Hogard at Rutgers University, for example, who has done some really innovative work using Confederates, also Sean Jones at Virginia Commonwealth University, where they've used really intricate ways to look at vicarious racism and the use of Confederates, such that individuals are being measured as there are these different racism experiences happening live and in vivo. Okay. All right, I want to wrap up here so that we have some time for questions. I'll just mention briefly in terms of research training that this is a method that, you can, I did 2 years of postdoctoral training in cardiovascular psychophysiology, and even with 2 years of training, I feel not as knowledgeable as I would like. This is a really area of expertise that requires professional training if you really want to dig deeply. And so similar to what some of the other presenters have mentioned, I encourage, if you want to learn these types of methods, that you can seek out investigators who use them, or seek those folks out to be collaborators on your grants. The actual attaching and training of putting sensors or electrodes on is fairly straightforward. It's not very difficult. But in terms of really understanding what you're doing and the sympathetic nervous system and the sort of psychological or psychophysiological conceptual models, that type of thing requires a little bit more training. There also have been different training workshops that are done by a vendor that I've worked with, Mindware Technologies, that allows individuals to come to Ohio for 3 or 4 days and learn about specific measures. And so that's a kind of intermediary way that can introduce you to these types of methods and the analysis that's involved. And they often have scholarships for students to participate in this kind of training. Okay, finally, just some quick references here for folks. I want to comment really briefly, kind of a new area that we're thinking about in some work that we're doing is how do changes in stress reactivity occur over time. So we're doing a longitudinal study where we're following and measuring people as they imagine these vignettes over time. And the second paper that's listed there by Hinnon and colleagues looks at how you would use this kind of imagery paradigm or some sort of stressor in a repeated measures fashion, maybe a year at a time, to model changes in physiological stress responsivity. And if you've been paying attention to the literature in this area, you know that there's been an argument that perhaps early childhood experiences, adverse child events, can contribute to changes in physiological responsivity that have implications for subsequent health. And so we're beginning to think about how we can look at this over time. Okay, so I'll stop here and turn it over to the moderators. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neblett. At this time, I would like to welcome our facilitator of the Q&A session, Dr. Angela Chow from Indiana University, Bloomington. She's a member of the Asian Caucus Outreach and Communication Subcommittee. So I would like to pass the session to Dr. Chow now.
Hello, I'm Angela Chow. This is my honor to be the facilitator of this Q&A section. Now we have about 20 to 30 minutes of asking questions, and we have been collecting questions from our participants. But if you have any last-minute question you really want to ask, please feel free to type in your question on the chat box. And now this is our first questions, and this question's going to Dr. Subrahmanyam. So Dr. Subrahmanyam, can we ask, how can research, I see Subrahmanyam kind of go offline. So,
unmuting myself, excuse me, I did the wrong button.
Okay, so Dr. Subrahmanyam, can we ask, so how can research about technology among children keep up with the pace of the advancement and changes of technology?
You know, that's a really excellent question. And I think the best way, well, let me back up here. I'm not sure we can ever truly keep up with the pace of change. The other problem, of course, is there's so much more money in technology and industry, and it costs money as well to keep up with the technology, and you know, it gets obsolete almost immediately as it is introduced. So personally, what I have found useful is two things. One is, rather than focus on the particular technology per se, I think it's easier or more productive to focus on the affordances and what you can do. So just to give you an idea, rather than focusing on private messaging in Facebook, focus on the idea of having private communication. So then if you're focusing on an application or an activity rather than a tool, then it becomes generalizable across tools. The other thing I think is to really root your research in developmental frameworks, developmental theory, developmental research, because then again you have continuity. So to revert back to the content analysis example, we found that by adopting a developmental framework where we looked at developmental challenges that adolescents face, then the work became easier to handle, and it could also become translatable and applicable even as the technology changed.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Subrahmanyam. So now we have our second question, and this questions go to Dr. Bámaca. And Dr. Bámaca, can we ask, so for your research that collecting intensive data using diary method, so what can you give us any tips to maintain participant fidelity to daily reporting using technology? So what is your secret?
Well, we will find out. We're actually doing a pilot study right now with 30 Latino adolescents and their one caregiver. And it's a 14-day daily diary, EMA, 3 times a day. And we actually monitor every day their response. Like we try to see if they completed the survey or they didn't complete the survey. And if the person is not being very responsive, we send them texts every day. So we have in our phone application, we actually give them phones too. And the phone service has texting so that we can communicate with them. And if they are not being compliant, then we tell them, oh, we've noticed that you did not complete your surveys yesterday. We hope that you can, please remember to complete them today. And if they are compliant, we send them text, not every day because it's too much. We send them text maybe every 2-3 days, where we tell them, great job, keep doing it. But at this point, I really don't know yet, the patterns. So I guess stay tuned for compliance. But it definitely, we do have definitely issues already with some participants in terms of their participation, but not as many yet. But we only have right now 13 families so far that have completed the study.
Okay, and we have one follow-up question. So what is your feel of using money incentive? What is your perspective and experience in using money to boost their participation?
Yeah, so IRB definitely has a lot of parameters. I mean, every IRB is different, but you definitely have to kind of go by the literature and what they usually do in terms of paying participants. Some studies actually pay them if you complete for every week you get $25. Others actually pay them. So if you have a 3-week study, you can get up to $75. And then you can have additional incentives for being compliant and completing the surveys within a certain time limit, right? So you don't want a kid coming at 10 p.m., completing the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. You want them to actually complete the survey within a specific time window. So for us, we give them 2 hours to complete it, and in the hopes that they will do that. For us, there's also IRB issues in my institution in that if you spend more than $100 on a participant at any given time, if they get $100, then they actually need to provide their social security number. And of course, I'm not gonna do that. So you have to get creative in terms of how are you gonna give them enough compensation, but perhaps not as much on a daily basis. So what we are actually doing is giving them pre-incentives. So when they do the baseline, the day that we come in and give them a baseline interview and we explain to them about the EMA portion or the smartphone portion, that day the adolescent gets $10 for just saying, yes, I will do the EMA, and the parent will get $20 just for saying yes. So we give them a gift card already automatically at the beginning of the study. To get them, to be excited about the study. And then I give them $2 per survey, so $6 per day. It truly is a balance in terms of your limitations too with the population that you are working with. And so my population, they can be undocumented. Low SES families don't like to give their social security away just for no reason. We try to always give them gift cards or cash, but that then creates a lot more limit for us.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience, Dr. Bámaca-Colbert. And we know that Dr. Subrahmanyam also have some experience. So can you share your perspective and your experience?
Sure. So, I did my daily diary study with college students, freshmen who are in a large psychology class who got subject credit. So it did matter for their course, and I know that it was challenging in terms of attrition. Keep having them, stay in the study, consistently fill out the diaries. I think, we ended up with a sample of close to, I forget the exact numbers, but we had to do, at least 25%, 30% more to get to that. And definitely it was a challenge with the male students. We finished collecting diaries from female students a long time before we could get at least an equivalent split. And even then we were about 60-40. So there are certainly gender differences in inclination to participate and keep being compliant and actually finish the study. I would agree with Dr. Bámaca-Colbert. You absolutely, I think, have to give some incentive that is meaningful to them. So for our students, we gave academic credit. I know that when I've tried doing this with high school students without, with just a raffle, that was not sufficient. I didn't have external funding at that time, so I was not able to give a more substantial gift card. And like her, we have the same challenges. Depending upon the source of funding, we sometimes are asked to get receipts. And again, working with immigrant populations, immigrant families, that is a real issue. So we try to get around it by giving gifts sometimes, like school supplies, etc. That's not quite the same as a gift card. We have state regulations that prohibit us from giving gift cards if it's state funds. So there are some of those challenges that make life very difficult. But yeah, I think what I would recommend for anybody, I was really excited when I heard, started realizing the potential of daily diary, I would say start small, do a pilot study. And, really, I think what was said by Dr. Bámaca-Colbert, it has to be small, short, so it's not taking up so much time, because otherwise people lose interest. And also, mine was only 1 week. I think yours is longer. I would again say start small, start short survey, 1 week, maybe do a trial pilot testing. And then if things looks like it works, then scale up.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Subrahmanyam. And now we have another questions coming from our attendees, and these questions go to Dr. Neblett. And Dr. Neblett, and can we ask what are the key challenges of conducting psychophysiological study? And also, if a junior early scholar want to go into this direction, so you already mentioned what kinds of training is needed, but then how about research funding? So is it very expensive to buy all these equipment?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of different questions there. Let me start with the equipment that's required. It can be somewhat costly depending on it's relative, right? So I think a startup for my lab back in, when I priced it about 5 years ago, was on the order of $150,000 to be able to set up a lab, a psychophysiology laboratory. There are smaller projects, I think, that you can do where that was kind of thinking about what would be top of the line for what I was interested in. But it can be expensive, so you have to think about the actual equipment itself, and then also far less expensive are the actual electrodes and the gel that you need to apply. We keep, razors in the lab for individuals who may have hair in places that need to be removed, et cetera. So those sorts of things are, not too expensive. Alcohol, rubbing alcohol, et cetera. It's really, the cost of the psychophys equipment. And what I would recommend is that folks most universities often have people who are already using these measures, and it may be possible to kind of share resources in doing the work. I think, was there another part of the question that I missed?
So for the training, so you already mentioned about the training. So if like a early career scholar want to go into this direction, so your suggestions is like finding a postdoc position and also to link up with other group, right? So is it like going to take a long time, or does it need to have some medical science background?
You don't need a medical science background. So my training is not in medical science, it's in psychology. As I mentioned in the presentation, I did a 2-year postdoc, and by the end of 2 years, I felt competent in kind of understanding the data, what I was looking at, and being able to run the experiment by myself. You can do smaller trainings like a 3-day workshop or things like that, but your level of understanding is going to be proportional or relevant to the amount of training that you spent. So I think that you can do shorter periods of time. Not everyone's able to do a postdoc. And then increasingly, you can understand the basics in terms of doing data analysis and what's going on, even without doing a 2-year postdoc. But what I found in my experience is that if you really want to be an expert in this area and understand the methods and conduct the work, it really requires, kind of advanced training beyond a couple of days.
Okay, thank you. And I see that Dr. Bámaca-Colbert, you type in something about NIH training, like K Award. Elaborate on it.
Well, I just wanted to know that, and I don't know if Dr. Neblett would agree, but there are training grants, at NIH that might also give you the time to train in a new area like a K Award. So, I mean, definitely there are complicated grants to apply to and get, but if you are in an environment already that perhaps has, experts in that area, and you have a good team that can guide you as mentors, then you can also write a grant. The K grant definitely is for training in a new direction.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier in the well, I guess you can write a K really at a number of different periods. But yes, I would agree that a K or some of the early career awards that different organizations have would be a possible way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And then now we still have 10 minutes, and then we have some more general questions that about the trend in methodology in general. So this question is, so in your, according to your observation, what are the noticeable trend in developmental methodology do you expect in 5 years, and how we should respond and react to such trends? So maybe each of you can share your wisdom on this question. So
Okay.
yes.
Can you give us the question one more time?
Okay, yeah, sure. So according to your observation, what are the trends in developmental methodology that you expect in 5 years? And then for researcher, how we should react and respond to this new opportunity. So I see Dr. Bámaca-Colbert, you are nodding. So can you go first in answering this question?
I'm just listening. Well, I would say, I mean, let me just say that I'm in a place where innovative methods are the way that people are writing grants, the way that they're doing research. So it's a very exciting place to be, but also, you know, overwhelming because there's a lot of different innovative methods that you can utilize in your work. And sometimes I do struggle, to be honest with you, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm a very straightforward individual, so sometimes I don't really watch what I say, but I get a little concerned that sometimes the methods are driving the research in a way that you really lose the meaning of research in terms of the population that you want to study and the questions that you might have. And, you know, unfortunately, in academia, I think that we are at a time when the methods and the agencies that give us money are determining what is important and not too important to study. So, I mean, that's part of being in academia. So you just have to kind of be creative and try to continue doing the work that you really care about and trying to start, you know, talking to other people about how to do it in more innovative ways. In my work, I'm definitely very interested in contextual realities, you know, how those contextual realities change. And so implementing EMA was just a natural progression for me. But I would say that there are forces sometimes outside of the individual that can definitely make us move in directions that we might really not want to go. But, you know, we go there because that's what agencies are telling you to do in order to get the funding. And you need money. That's the unfortunate side of it all, is that with these innovative methods, you do need the financial component to be there so that you can actually end up doing the work. It is expensive to do this work. But that's my own personal opinion. So, you know, it's great in some ways, and it's not that great. You have to be very cognizant about how to go about that.
Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. So Dr. Subrahmanyam, so do you have anything to add?
Sure, you know, I share some of the same concerns that Dr. Bámaca-Colbert said. I think the trend that I see is big data. With, you know, big data has a lot of potential. The technology, like, you know, the wearables, even the psychophysiology is mobile and has a lot of opportunity, you know, opens up a lot of opportunities. But again, I think we have to be careful and not let the method or the tool drive our research. You know, I have a student who's looking into PhD programs, and she came to me and said, you know, I'm so excited. The mentor has an app that they put on these programs and recording all communication. So I said, why exactly do you think that's a good thing? Like, what are you getting? What's the value added that you don't get otherwise? And she actually wasn't able to go further with it. And so I think, again, the school factor is there with technology, and I think we have to be careful about it. And I don't want to be a Luddite, and I don't want to be a skeptic, or maybe it's just me growing older, I'm not sure. But I think at the end of the day, you have to have the research questions, drive the method, drive what you do, and not the other way around.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Neblett, so do you have anything that you can kindly share with us?
Well, I think I spoke to a couple of the directions I see the field going in my presentation. So I think, you know, if we really want to understand how racial disparities develop and worsen over the life course, the work that looks at these types of things is going to have to be looking over a longer period of time. So multiple timeframes are important. I think oftentimes a lot of the psychophysiology work we've done is kind of a short time frame. It's kind of snapshot, or within, you know, a couple of minutes, maybe we follow someone for 24 hours. But if we really want to begin to understand changes in reactivity and the mechanisms that underlie how adverse child experiences may, you know, kind of link to, I think, you know, people are talking about changes in DNA methylation and all these sorts of things. We have to be able to have a long-term perspective. So one trend that I see is looking at changes in reactivity over longer periods of time that extend beyond kind of an experimental manipulation.
Okay, so so let me see the time. So these 2 hours really go fast. So I think, yes, I think this is the end of our webinar today. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to all our speakers today for sharing their wisdom and their experience with us. It's really a wonderful experience for me, and I believe it's shared among all the attendants to hear your experience, and then we all learn from you. Thank you very much. And thank you for
having us.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all our participants for spending your time with us today. Please continue support SRCD and the free caucuses, and see you all soon in our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.